To acknowledge that it is St. Patrick's Day, and I don't know how well you can see my button uh, that I'm wearing, but what it says, I'm sure it's almost impossible to read, is roses are red, violets are bluish. A leprechaun told me St. Patrick was Jewish. I've been wearing that for 40 some years. My mother-in-law, uh, may she rest in peace, gave it to me, and it gets to be worn once every year. So thank you all for coming, bottom line, and welcome. We're doing 5 sessions on this. I mean, there's so many others we could do, and each one of these sessions that we're going to do is bigger than an hour. But the goal here is to try to give you a taste, I guess, of this topic, get you at least hopefully a little new information and some new perspectives, which is in part my way of saying if there's something you want to hear about, or have questions about, whatever, tell me, and maybe I'll be able either to work it into the next sessions, or we could always do other sessions somewhere along the line. So it's just a starting point. The goal today is to kind of set the stage and give us a running start so that at least we're all kind of talking from the same page, and then to look at the ghettos in particular. They were central to what happened and how they operated and so on. And so that will be the other piece of what we do today. And my hope is to highlight, starting with today, one of the key lessons I think in all of the sessions that we do is the ambiguity. The Holocaust is not a black and white topic. There's just, so many shades on this that it hopefully will make that interesting. In the next sessions, we'll look at survival, and particularly do that because our Yom HaShoah speaker on that Sunday morning is, as I had mentioned at one point, the child of survivors, and has a remarkable story of what went on. And then we'll talk about resistance and rescue and what does justice look like. But for today, I guess the thing is, we begin with how did this all start? And, bottom line on that is that Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in Austria. And his early years are certainly important, but they're a topic all their own. I'm not about to go do a biography of Adolf Hitler, but I mentioned that he was born in Austria in 1889, in part because I think it's important to recognize he wasn't even a German citizen. He was born in Austria. He did not become a German citizen until 1932. So, he lived in Germany, and certainly in the post-World War I era, he was there, but not as a citizen. Right after World War I, he helped to found what became the Nazi Party. That party was created largely as a reaction to World War I, and perhaps equally or more important, the Versailles settlement that followed it. Recognized that the Nazis were a minor party among dozens of parties. This was a multi-party system. And they never, got even 2.5% of the popular vote until after the Depression in 1929. So for the first 10 years, when I say they were a minor party, I mean like really minor party. But the Depression changed the appeal of different parties and the power of different parties. People tend in times like that to gravitate to the extremes, which was the communists on the left and the Nazis on the right. And so they began to become more significant. That being said, they weren't the largest party in Germany. They never got a majority of the vote in any election where other parties were allowed to run as well. They peaked probably in 1932 at about 37% of the popular vote. And actually later in 1932, they had dropped back to about 33% of the vote. So they weren't even the largest party, but they eventually got their chance, because no party, even the Social Democrats, who were the largest, could not put together a governing coalition, and a bunch of coalition governments failed. In January of 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were given their chance to create a coalition that might be more viable. The result being that on January 30th of 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. which is like the prime minister, the guy who runs the thing. One of the things to recognize this, and my students, when I taught it in high school, were shocked, is that he did it all legally. There's nothing illegal about how Hitler came to power. He was legitimately named and put together a coalition, and everybody waits to say, when was the coup? Well, there wasn't, that's is what it boils down to. But once he gained power, he very quickly began to expand that power and change the rules. Notably, just a couple weeks later, when the Reichstag building was set on fire, the Reichstag being the equivalent of our Congress. That was the legislature, and their building was set on fire. A man was arrested for setting that fire. He was a homeless communist, probably.
I'm sorry.
Probably of somewhat dubious. Is that a question, Vanessa? Or no, we're good. Okay.
No, not everybody's muted, so I'm
Gotcha.
gonna go in.
Okay.
I'm gonna go in and mute everyone.
He, whether he really set the fire, we're not sure. Some people think maybe he set it because members of the Nazi Party handed him the gasoline, the matches, and said, it's cold out here tonight. Why don't you go set a fire and make yourself warm? Don't really know for sure. It's never been proved. But the bottom line is he was a member of the Communist Party, and this became, therefore, the one, the cause to blame the communists, and it gave Hitler the chance to invoke what was called Article 48 of the German Constitution. Article 48 was designed to allow the chancellor, in cases of an emergency, to assume basically dictatorial power, to be able to rule by decree. This was not the first time that was invoked. It actually was used several times during crises in the 1920s and so on. But Hitler now invoked Article 48 and took absolute power and used that to begin to change the landscape. Notably, at this point, he built the first concentration camp, Dachau, outside of Munich, and used it really to send the communists. There wasn't enough room in the jails. And so he rounded up the communists for causing this fire and sent them to Dachau, and then other political opponents went there, which means, if you think about it, the first concentration camp, Dachau, it was not built for housing the Jews. Certainly, that eventually became part of what happened, but it was designed really for other purposes. The camps in general are their own topic. Not one I envision doing over these sessions particularly, in part because I assume most of you are at least a little more familiar with the camps. But I'll throw, just one or two thoughts to you before I move on. Notably, anybody have any idea how many concentration camps there actually were in Europe? No takers?
7.
7? Maybe a little more?
I'd say dozens.
Dozens?
I think there were hundreds.
Okay, hundreds. The actual, I guess let's call it most commonly accepted number is over 20,000 concentration camps, which is amazing. Now, part of that, understand, is a matter of definition, because you have camps that were satellites of other camps. An example, for those of you familiar with Schindler's List, the Plaszow concentration camp that was built to take in the Warsaw Ghetto, when Schindler opened his factory, they allowed him to bring in his workers and house them there. So that became a sub-camp of Plaszow. So is that 2 camps or 1 camp? So that 20,000 number is a little debatable, I suppose, on definition, but it's much more extensive, I think, than most people realize. The other thing that is perhaps important is to recognize that there were only 6 camps out of all of them that are what we call the death camps, the ones that were built and designed for the express and sole purpose, essentially, of murdering Jews. And all the others were forced labor and collection points and so on. But Majdanek and Sobibor, Chelmno, Birkenau, which was part of Auschwitz, All of them built in Poland. The other one that I will mention, particularly given that today is March 17th, was Belcheck, which was the sixth of the camps. Yeah, some people estimate over 40,000. Again, it's all a matter of definition, but it sure is a big number, no question about that. Belcheck was one of the death camps, and actually it was March 17th of 1942 that it became operational. And they shipped, the first thing they did was ship in 30,000 Jews from the Lublin ghetto. So that's where, that kind of fits into this. The bottom line is, as Hitler banned political opposition and gained power, he began to enact other things, notably a piece of legislation that was called the Enabling Act. What the Enabling Act did, most importantly, is basically make Article 48 permanent. And so it was really that allowed him to continue his dictatorship and create the police state and so on that followed. Persecution of the Jews. Let me real quickly, Evie, your question, whether they began as death camps, the answer is it kind of depends on which one. Most of those 6 were built explicitly as death camps. Birkenau was actually a sub-camp of Auschwitz, which had been built earlier as a concentration camp and a forced labor camp. There were technically there was Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, Auschwitz III. There were actually multiple sections of it. And Birkenau, the death camp, it was designed as a death camp. That's Auschwitz II, technically. The persecution of the Jews begins really pretty much right away. The first book burnings, the boycott of Jewish merchants by April of 33, they were already doing that. But the thing to note is that this all was a gradual process. Discrimination starts from the very beginning, but the whole thing is a process built around Nazi philosophy, which, if we were going to really simplify and summarize Nazi philosophy, it's all about race and space. Space, notably being the need for what they call autarky, which is self-sufficiency of resources. And to do that was going to require resources and space in the East. Hitler said from day one that he would invade Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union. And that's what that was about. The race part, of course, is the genetic issue of the fact that Hitler and the Nazis viewed really the history of mankind as a Darwinian struggle for racial supremacy, with the superior race, of course, being the Aryans, and the Jews qualifying at best as barely human at the bottom of the barrel. But the key to that is genetic. And so what that means, people will sometimes say, well, why didn't Jews, convert and get away from all of this? And the reality is that wouldn't do you any good, because in the Nazi philosophy, because it was genetic and even your ethics were genetic, if you converted, it didn't matter. You were still genetically inferior. And so that's kind of what governed this. And that begins from from day one. It wasn't until 1935, a couple of years later, that Hitler passed or really created what became known as the Nuremberg Laws, hundreds of regulations denying Jews all kinds of privileges and job classifications and curfews and so on, but most importantly, stripping the Jews of their citizenship. And with no citizenship, they have no legal protection, no right to vote. That became really instrumental in this whole thing. And although certainly Jews were mistreated, and there was, people that were attacked and so on early on, there really was no government-sanctioned violence until 1938. In November of 1938, Kristallnacht, which again is a topic all its own, but presumably one that at least most of us here they have at least kind of heard of and a little familiar with. The bottom line on Kristallnacht is that was the first officially government-sanctioned violence against the Jews, a pogrom in essence, nationwide. And from there, of course, it only got worse. But even then, The goal of the Nazi Party was to drive the Jews out. Annihilation of the Jews is a policy that evolved over time and really over the next few years. It didn't happen right away. So, that's kind of where that starts from. And then, of course, World War II breaks out on September 1st of 1939 and complicates the whole thing because now expulsion of the Jews became virtually impossible. Not only did it become virtually impossible, but now they got over 3 million more Jews under their care when they conquer Poland. And the question becomes, what do you do with them? And so what happened, allow me to kind of show you here, just briefly, what happens next. And in essence, share that one. There we go. And there he is. What happened with the beginning of the war is that a guy by the name of Reinhard Heydrich, who is really one of the more, I guess we could say, detestable people in my humble estimation in history, was given the responsibility of dealing with this issue and what to do with the Jews. And so it was within 3 weeks, September 21st, that he issued an order saying, for the time being, the first prerequisite for the final aim is the concentration of Jews from the countryside into the larger cities. This is the creation of the ghettos, which we're going to, kind of talk about and look at this point. And so they begin to congregate them in the larger cities. One of the other things he said at this point is that within each Jewish community, there was to be a council of Jewish elders that became known as the Eudenrat. They were to be created, and they were the ones who were going to be responsible for the execution of directives. And we'll kind of come back to that. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about the Eudenrat, but let me talk about the ghettos in a broader sense first, and then return to that piece of this. The largest of the ghettos was in Warsaw. The head count on Warsaw depends a little on who you ask, but about 450 to 500,000 people crammed into the Warsaw Ghetto. The next largest ghetto was in the city of Lodz. And this will be my official disclaimer of my pronunciation of Polish. Give it my best shot. Lodz is Lodz. I have heard it pronounced by Polish people 3 or 4 different ways. So, for whatever it's worth, but the Lodz Ghetto was about 200,000 people. So it's a fraction of the size of Warsaw. And the rest of them were 100,000 and less. There were ghettos created all over Europe, some in Western Europe, a lot of them in the East. Interestingly, none in Germany. All of the ghettos are outside of Germany. Any Jew that was arrested in Germany was either in a concentration camp or sent to a ghetto in another country, presumably out east in almost every instance. But that's the ghettos. People basically were given minimal notice, usually just a couple of hours, but at best a couple of days, and basically told, you're being moved into the ghetto. And they're forced to move into this severely limited area, to take whatever they could carry with them, and everything else is left behind. So if you've seen, for example, scenes like, The Pianist is one of the ones I used to use in my class. I didn't use a lot of videos today because they take too long. But The Pianist shows people moving in, all their furniture, their artwork, most of their wardrobe, everything gets left behind, and they take what they can carry and move into this ghetto where they were assigned housing. Generally, there were about 6 to 7 people per room in these homes, and put on a starvation diet, basically held to 200 calories per day on average, which, 200 calories per day means they were subsisting on a McDonald's hamburger, basically. We're told today you should have about 2,000 calories a day. That's sort of the average. And the Germans were allowed 2,000 calories a day. The average Pole, for what it's worth, when they were occupied, was given 800 calories a day. Jews, 200. So basically, they were starving them to death. Some of the people in the ghetto were able to supplement that a little bit if they were working. It would still be grossly insufficient, but work helped a little bit. And that's actually an important thought, because one of the keys to survival, whether it be in the ghetto or a camp or anywhere, is being able to work. Not only because it might get you a little extra food, but frankly, what it really boiled down to was the Nazi attitude that if you were able to work as slave labor, you might be allowed to exist a little longer. The day you couldn't work because you weren't capable of the task, or you were too sick or whatever, was pretty much the end. That's when they'd send you off and get rid of you, because they didn't want anybody who couldn't work. The ghettos were just rampant disease and filth. The Warsaw Ghetto, it is estimated that somewhere around 80,000 people died from the conditions there, the disease, the starvation, and so on. I'm not even talking about the ones that were murdered or were deported or any of that. And of course, there's this just pervasive fear. So, that's kind of what this experience was. I mean, this is a picture of Warsaw in 1941, and it begins to give you a sense of the crowding, with the people walking the streets really with nowhere to go and nothing to do. The Warsaw Ghetto was created in 1940. It, as I said, about the better part of 500,000 people in
Jim,
three.
are you sharing a picture?
There is a picture on here, yes.
Okay, we
that?
don't see it.
Really?
Yeah.
No, I can
I
see.
see it.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute.
I
I'm
see
on
it.
2 screens. That must be it.
Okay.
Never mind, continue.
And a lovely picture.
Fuck you, internet.
Okay, well, I'm glad it shows. You never know. How would we have made it through the pandemic without Zoom? But it does have its moments. That's bottom line on this is you had 500,000 people in 3.5 square miles. No, Jews were 30% of the population of Warsaw prior to the war. And of course, you're also bringing in Jews from the countryside. And they were crammed into 2.4% of the city's area. So that's what you're looking at. And people just, they mill around. They are subject to, searches on the streets for identification and what they might have with them. Humiliation. There's horrible stories about people, with the cutting off of the earlocks and different things that took place, as well as people literally just being murdered in the streets or just dying of starvation and so on, which is kind of the one picture down there in the middle. People just drop dead in the streets, and perhaps equally shocking about that picture is all the people just walking by because they're so used to it. And that's, part of the story too. Then in the summer of 1942, between July 22nd and September 21st of 1942, came the Great Deportation, as it was called. 300,000 Jews from the ghetto sent to Treblinka, one of the death camps, in this incredibly violent purge. And then ultimately in the spring of 1943 came the famous revolt of the Warsaw Ghetto, which we will talk about in a couple of weeks, more specifically when we talk about resistance. But that was the end of the ghetto. At the end of the uprising, that was also the end of the Warsaw Ghetto. Lodz was the second largest, as I mentioned. It was actually the oldest of the ghettos. It was established in February of 1940, sealed off in April. Because, initially when the ghettos are first set up, they used fences and gates and so on. But eventually in most of the ghettos, not just Lodz, they would literally wall it off, brick walls across the streets and around everything, and totally enclose it so that people couldn't get in and out of them. If there was a rail line or a main street or something that ran through where the ghetto was, they're not going to inconvenience the people of the city for that. So what they would do was build just a large, tall bridge like the one you can see there in that picture, and force the residents of the ghetto to scale the bridge back and forth to get from one section of the ghetto to the other. And of course, the conditions there, like all of them, were, this incredibly filthy, unsanitary conditions. I mean, that's this testimony, talks about the filth. It was filthy even in the building where we lived in the wintertime. I mean, the toilet it was ice, it was all ice, and then the feces and urine all over was overflowing. It's just incredible conditions that they're dealing with. And so, that's kind of, what these things looked like and what you were dealing with in all of this. So I guess the question becomes why? Why ghettos? Why this whole structure? And of course, part of that has to do with separation and getting the Jews out of the way and not mingling with everybody else. But it also serves the purpose of getting them out of the public view. For everybody else, because now they're behind walls and they know what's going on. They can smell it, they can hear it. It's not that there's total ignorance, but basically they don't have to look at it all the time. They don't have to face it. And obviously it's much easier to control the Jews at this point. The other thing is to realize that these ghettos were usually built near a rail stop, which made it easier to transport people both in and, more importantly, out when the time came. And these ghettos enabled the Nazis to begin the weeding out process because the conditions killed so many people off. It also allowed them to begin looting their possessions, because, as I said, it's what you could carry to bring in, so they could seize what was left behind and distribute it among the population or take it themselves or whatever. So that being said, there's all kinds of testimonies and things about this, but I thought it was worth sharing just quickly 2 very short segments with you. And so I'm going to go back to screen sharing. The first one is a guy, I think if I remember, his first name was Joseph Morton, who talks a little bit about what life was like. Let's see, there we go. So hopefully you'll be able to hear it all right without my dog helping.
Did you press the share sound?
I'm sorry, what?
When you went to share this, did you press share sound?
Oh, no, I didn't. Thank you. That's what I did wrong.
Okay.
All right, let's fix that.
At least this interruption, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I know better. I should have done that. And I blew it. And then my dog decided that there was a squirrel out there that was just too good to miss. So let's continue with him, actually.
On the streets. But besides all that, they would come in, close up streets, made everybody go down in the yard or on the streets.
We got too far on it. Let me try this
on the
again.
street. Being in the ghetto,
There we go.
the starvation was very tremendous.
There we go.
People were dying for hunger as it was going on the streets. But besides all that, they would come in, close up streets, made everybody go down in the yard or on the streets. And they would always take people away. And that was going on all through the years being in the ghetto. You were always living in fear. Besides being hungry, you had the fear with it.
The fear is such a big piece of this, but also the conditions and the starvation. So the other excerpt I've got for you
They started to send in
not him.
the
But here we go. George.
Some families
Shane Farben.
were fighting in the way, taking bread from each other. And that was so sad that when I used to bring home the ratio, my mother cut the bread in four pieces. It was a loaf of bread. And we had a scale at home where we used to weigh the bread so nobody would have more or less bread, that we all share the same. Same thing was with sugar. We have a little bit of sugar. We used to weigh it And I used to bring the ratio of marmalade or whatever else. So everybody has exactly the same portion. But mostly bread was the main staple. It was dark bread. It was bread probably baked with wild chestnut or something like that. It wasn't just flour, rye flour. That's all we could think of as bread. And so it was a lot of rivalry going on among families. They were hurting each other because of that, yeah.
Which is one of the remarkable stories you hear over and over again, families that fought over food. And almost every survivor I've met, and I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of them, one of the things they overwhelmingly talk about is the starvation and the hunger and how incredibly difficult that was. And so, you know, this is what they faced. And the challenge becomes how to control that. And how do you govern over that? And clearly part of that is in the physical limits of the ghetto, the intimidation and the fear that they talked about. But the real key was the Eudenrat. So with the time we've got at this point, let's talk a little bit about the Eudenrat. The Eudenrat basically usually it was about 12 to 24 members, a governing council, if you will. To become a member of the Eudenrat, either you would be appointed by the Nazi governors to do that, or they might hold elections, and obviously anybody who was elected had to be approved by the government to do that. But it was their responsibility then to implement the policies and directives that were issued. They were the ones who moved the people in. They were the ones who assigned housing to them, which of course means that, you know, one person got slightly better housing than another, somebody's going to be angry. They were the ones who distributed the rations. They were the ones who created the support organizations. And most of these ghettos had hospitals, even though they really didn't have any medicine, but they did the best they could with what they could. Orphanages, because children were left, you know, when parents died or whatever. Most importantly, in a sense, though, is they're the ones who both chose the workers who got selected into a work detail, and they were the ones who had to choose who gets deported when the trains were being done. And so the question becomes, why use this method? And of course, it starts, as I kind of indicated, because the blame and the responsibility gets now put on other Jews. Instead of it being directed to the Nazis, if you don't like your housing, well, blame the Eudenrat. They're the ones who signed it to you. And so it becomes that kind of an issue. It also saved manpower for the Nazis. It gave the Jews a sense of security and control in the sense that they had some input and somebody there. And it all really was part of one of the tactics that the Nazis used to govern, which is often called forced choice. Forced choice, to try to simplify it really quickly, is in essence giving somebody two options, or three or whatever, but I mean giving them a couple of options, all of which are horrible, but making them choose, which makes them buy into it, feel the guilt for their choice. It's very controlling. One of the best examples I can give you, and again, it's a matter of time and what it takes to do this with what we've got. Some of you may be familiar with the movie Sophie's Choice, which, if not, I'm sure if you go to YouTube, you'd find the scene on it in which Meryl Streep, Sophie, is standing on the train platform, having just arrived at Birkenau with her two young children, and one of the guards comes up to her and basically says to her, "You can keep one of your children, the other one is going. Which is it going to be? Choose." And of course, her immediate response, I can't choose. And he said, "Then I'll take them both." And starts to grab them both and basically forces the choice. It's a horrific scene to watch. So if you do look on YouTube, be forewarned, it's just miserably uncomfortable to see. But that's part of what this was all about. And the members of the Eudenrat, I don't know, are they collaborators because they're helping cooperate? Or I don't know, maybe not. Why do people accept a position in the Eudenrat? I mean, we can start with the fact that it's pretty hard to refuse, because if the Nazis came to you and said, you're on the Eudenrat, and you said no, you were probably going to be on the next train headed to a death camp. And it didn't take long before they figured out that that's where those trains were going. As well as the feeling, well, if I don't, somebody else is going to. Somebody's got to do this. But these people are hard to assess. You know, some of them are pretty altruistic. They think that maybe they can keep the Nazis away and there'll be less abuse and they'll help the people. They think that maybe they can help people or even save people. Others, maybe not so altruistic, a little more selfish. They can protect, obviously, themselves and their friends and their family, because they're in the position to control some of these things. They can get extra resources, food or otherwise, and they might do it licitly, they might do it illicitly, but they have some ability to control that. And of course, there's people who just get off on the power of it all. But, you know, the question becomes whether you're selling your soul to the enemy when you do this. You're certainly going to antagonize a certain number of people in the ghetto. It's inevitable. You become highly visible. So basically you risk the wrath of the Nazis if you don't do something quickly enough, well enough, whatever that might be. Of the first 30 members of the Lodz Ghetto, 22 of them were shot within the first few weeks, as an example, to force, you know, people to understand what they were going to have to do. So the question becomes, how do you handle this? And so I'm going to try to real quickly look at two cases here, real briefly, and so we can have some discussion about this. And that's the goal, is real quickly, I'll explain these two, and then maybe we can take this a little further. So we go back one more time, up to this, and to you, and whoops, go back one. There we go. Okay, so the picture at the top is a guy by the name of Mordecai Rumkowski. And there's a picture. He was the head of the Eudenrat in the Lodz Ghetto. He was appointed the chairman in October of 1939. Picture of Rumkowski in the center and the rest of the Eudenrat there behind him. He's very controversial. There's terrible, terrible stories about Mordecai Rumkowski, of abuse, of corruption, of things that he may have done to women in exchange for privileges, even worse stories about very young women, not even, you know, women at all, but girls. We don't know that they're true. We don't know that they're not true, so you got to be really careful. I mean, you know, I guess, unfortunately, in a manner of speaking, anybody who would really be in a position to testify didn't survive to do so. So, but there's terrible stories about Rumkowski. He's very, very controversial, but he was the virtual dictator of Lodz. The other side of that, though, is he set up factories that employed thousands of people and prolonged their lives. He did other things when the rabbis, for example, were forbidden to perform their work. He performed marriages and you know, other religious rites and so on for the rabbis in an effort to keep their lives alive. And then he faced, in September of 1942, the situation where, in essence, he was told to turn people over for deportation to the death camps, including the children and the elderly. And ultimately turned over 20,000 people at that point to do that. Since you're not a class, I didn't pre-assign reading. So let me just read one or two quick excerpts for you of the speech that Rumkowski gave on September 4th of 1942. In which he said, "A grievous blow has struck the ghetto. They're asking us to give up the best we possess, the children and the elderly. I never imagined I would be forced to deliver this sacrifice to the altar with my own hand. In my old age, I must stretch out my hands and beg, brothers and sisters, hand them over to me. Fathers and mothers, give me your children." And as you can imagine, that generated quite a response out of the crowd. And a little later, he continues, we reached the conclusion that however hard it would be for us, we should take the implementation of this order into our own hand. I must perform this difficult and bloody operation. I must cut off limbs in order to save the body itself. I must take children. If not, others may be taken as well. God forbid. I understand you, mothers. I also feel what you feel in your hearts, fathers. I share your pain. And my students almost invariably are skeptical of exactly how much pain he's really feeling. The last excerpt I'll read, he says, one needs the heart of a bandit to ask from you what I am asking, but put yourself in my place and think logically, and you'll reach the conclusion that I cannot proceed any other way. The part that can be saved is much larger than the part that must be given away. And so 20,000 children, elderly, and others were rounded up and taken off. Ultimately, the Lodz Ghetto was liquidated anyway, but it was the last of the ghettos. It lasted till 1944. When the ghetto was finally liquidated, Rumkowski was sent to Auschwitz along with everybody else. There's different stories about exactly what happened when he got to Auschwitz. I have heard a couple of different people who claim to have been there tell very different stories. So decide what you will, but the one thing we can say with a fair amount of certainty is Mordecai Rumkowski did not survive the experience at Auschwitz. So he, like everybody else, ended up in the same place. The question becomes whether he therefore accomplished anything and at what moral cost to do it. And I mention that in part because the contrast can be drawn to the guy you see on the bottom. And again, my Polish is going to betray me, but that is Adam Szynajkov, who was the head of the Warsaw Ghetto and Eudenrat. And of course, he too was criticized because some people get better treatment than others. It's inevitable, but not at all controversial like Rumkowski. I've never heard anything about corruption, abuse of power, and abuse of people. Szynajkov was, from all appearances, a pretty decent guy, given what he was being forced to do. But the way he handles it is so different than Rumkowski. During the Great Deportation in the summer of 1942, in July, he also was told to start producing people and send thousands of people to what he knew were the death camps. Szynajkov kept a diary. So I don't have a speech. What I've got is excerpts from his diary. On July 19th, he said, one of the entries says, among other things, I do not know whether I managed to calm the population, but I did my best. What it cost me, they do not see. A couple days later, on the 22nd of July, he says, by 4 p.m. today, a contingent of 6,000 people must be provided. And this, at the minimum, will be the daily quota. And when he went to the officer in charge of the deportation, the guy, well, what he goes on to say in the diary is that he asked me into his office and informed me that for the time being, my wife was free, but if the deportation were impeded in any way, she would be the first one to be shot as a hostage. The next day, July 23rd, he says, when I asked for the number of days per week in which the operation would be carried on, the answer was 7 days a week. It is 3 o'clock. So far, 4,000 are ready to go. The orders are that there must be 9,000 by 4 o'clock. And that's where the entries in his diary stop. And the reason the entries in the diary stop there is because at that point, he reached into his desk and pulled out a gun that he had there and committed suicide, shot himself. He just couldn't do it anymore. And so, very different story. And that, I guess, is kind of the point. And so we've got a few minutes left to do some discussion on this. And well, I don't know. We've got about 18 people. I don't know. I think probably, Vanessa, I'm going to bow to your experience, whether we're best off maybe splitting into about 3 or 4 rooms, or do you want to try to do this as a group?
Well, let's see if people have questions, and I'm gonna start. And I'm 99, I know the answer to this, but I just feel I have to answer this. It was only men on the Eudenrat, right?
As far as I know, I don't want to give you, I'll go with your 99. I don't want to guarantee something that I don't have the information on, but I've never seen a picture or heard of anybody other than men.
Wow. Does anyone else have any questions, or Karen, if you want to unmute, and because this is where her family is from, and
Yeah.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm at work. My computer is weird. Yeah, I mean, I guess, like I said in the chat, I just, I've talked to my parents a lot about my grandparents who were on my mom's side, who, and Jim knows my dad through Holocaust education work, and my grandparents, never really talked about this until much later, after my grandfather passed away. He never talked about it. My grandmother did much, much later in life, and actually mostly to my dad, because he was a Holocaust educator. But, I just try to think about like what it was like for them to give up their child in that roundup. And they were very loving people. My grandmother was just a Jewish grandmother who made really good chicken soup. And I just don't know how you survive something like that and still be loving. So it's just something I think about. And, as we all learn history and talk about this, I think it's important to try to learn those details of the victims and the survivors. I think it makes it more real, and it therefore prevents it from continuing to happen to other people. When you think about, like, my dad says that my grandfather really never talked about it, and when he did, it was clear he carried tremendous guilt. He must have had to do some things to survive that he felt pain about. So, I just think those details, those like really human details, help us more actively learn, and also, take more steps to prevent hate from starting in the first place. Like when you showed that picture of them crossing over a bridge, like that bridge, it's such an important detail to me. It's like a wall or a cage or and not to compare apples to apples, it's not, but those details are really important because these things obviously creep up on you. Our imaginations can't imagine the horrors. So, but seeing that is so important. Just that a bridge was created to literally move people away. So when we see those things, that's when we should be screaming, not when the horror is so present. So.
And yeah, I am. Karen's father has, as she said, I've met him through some education things and so on. I even have an email from him, which he did give me permission to share at one point, but I purposely was kind of holding back, and we'll see how we do at the end, because I didn't want to do that and bias that conversation. But let's just say he does not have much use for Rumkowski, to put it mildly, and went through some horrific stuff.
we have another question. Was there anything connecting who was on the Eudenrat? For example, profession, status, connections, etc.
To my knowledge, not really, other than the fact that for one reason or another, the Nazis felt they could manipulate them and do that. It wasn't that they were particularly leaders of the community or successful. Rumkowski in particular was not successful as a businessman and had no position really in the community and was not a popular guy. But apparently they felt they could manipulate him enough to elevate him to that position. And I think they took, probably generally they wanted people with some respect, because they needed the credibility, but I don't think there was a lot that tied him together.
Karen again wrote, my grandma was the sweetest person and stubborn, like Karen. Hard to imagine how you stay that way. And I think that we have seen, and people who came to Howard Reich's you know, he's talked about his parents and that even recently we begun to realize these people, Holocaust survivors had PTSD, and that psychologists didn't think about that immediately when seeing these people is kind of, it's really a revelation.
Yeah. And then it's passed through the generations. Sorry to interrupt you, but like the not talking about it, right? Like my mom growing up in a household that never acknowledged, and then, you know, it just gets passed. And then, you know, they say your DNA even can absorb trauma.
That was something I had mentioned briefly last Yom HaShoah when I was the speaker, because COVID shut us down from our plans.
Well,
and
I
talked a little
can't
about that.
find a Holocaust survivor who can Zoom, is my.
I have now, the last few days, sat through, I was at a conference, for want of a better term, with a whole group of them. And there's a few of them that are better than others, but yeah, you know, when you're 90 years old, this is not an easy thing to master.
Yeah.
Rick, you had something, I think.
Okay, I've unmuted. I don't want to make any apologies for Rumkowski, but I think there's something to be said for having the courage to take that position of making these ethical, very difficult, very complex ethical choices in that ghetto environment. The things that you laid out that position is responsible for these group of, I guess, just men, are immensely important to everyday living in that horrible environment. And although he might have apparently did abuse power, these are day-to-day, moment-to-moment decisions that had to be made under real pressured situations that affected thousands and thousands of our kindred Jewish brothers and sisters' lives. And not everybody would have been up to that task nor willing to accept those kinds of responsibilities. And I think they have to be looked at as, I don't know whether heroes is an overused word and not easy to define, but I think they have to be accorded a certain amount of leeway and respect to be willing to make those assignments, to be willing to make those determinations, to be willing to take on the heat and the disparagement that comes with those jobs.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And actually, we're going to end up not having the time to break into groups, I don't think, which is just fine. But where I was going to go with that was, in essence, to let people evaluate what they thought of these two guys, and was one better than the other, or accomplished more. But it certainly has to be said, and it is said about Rumkowski, that more people survived for a longer period of time in the Lodz ghetto than any of the other ghettos. And that's, that is an accomplishment of one sort. The price that was paid for it, I don't know. It depends on how you interpret the guy, but there's no question he did something that basically Shnyakov didn't, for all of the fact that it's very noble, perhaps, to say that he couldn't and wouldn't do it. He also didn't save anybody in the process.
Evie said, my dad was put into Dachau the morning after Kristallnacht, the only survivor of his family, and considered himself the lucky one. He rarely spoke about it, and I never knew what to ask. And I feel the effects which I've never been able to verbalize. We have a lot of survivor children in the class. So the other thing I did want to say there, and Jim will tell you, there's so much that you can look into. Although Wikipedia is fine, I like to go to Jewish Virtual Library. Here's something on Kristallnacht. I mean, there's speakers, there's Spielberg's done a lot of videos. So if
Yeah,
you're
the
looking
Shoah
for,
Foundation, if you want to look for that.
right. And you know what, Jim, you and I are going to have to put together a resource sheet because I'm sure people, will want to take the time and look into some of this.
Yeah.
Um,
In lieu of the resource sheet, and we can try to come up with a few different things on it. But if nothing else, if you go to, I guess I'll call it any of the big three museums, Yad Vashem has just a staggering amount of material on it. So does the U.S. Holocaust Museum. The third one I include because it's our museum, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. And they not only, they just do incredible programs and have tie-ins to all sorts of resources as well. So if there's an area you want to look at, that's definitely a place to start.
do we have any other, I'm gonna let me put the
Uh,
gallery view so I can see everything.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Please.
Susan.
Okay, my family was very fortunate in that they all left Europe well before this happened. So we have no Holocaust survivors. But my husband, who had been the CEO of an international company, was and did a lot of business in Germany and found it very, very painful to have to deal with people that he knew for sure had been Nazis. And it was, every time he came home from one of those trips, he was sick to his stomach because he had to do business with these people. And he was put in a position that he found really intolerable.
Yeah, I can only begin to imagine what that had to be like for him.
I mean, he was lucky, of course. I mean, I'm not complaining, nor did he, but just, for people, I mean, I think as Jews, we just don't get past that.
Yeah, and certainly one of the things, the last session, which I haven't written yet in detail, but one of the things we will try to talk a little bit about is this whole idea of justice, and there are people, and I'll talk about them at least a little bit, but eventually, but who will not do business to this day, will not do business with any German firm, Bayer Aspirin, or BMW or whatever
Right.
the case may be. And of course, that's really controversial too, whether that makes sense or doesn't make sense. I mean, you're also talking about how do people feel. I know one of the liberators of Buchenwald who I got to know him pretty well because he spoke many, many times for me. And he actually spoke at Lakeside many years ago. If anybody here remembers Abner Gannett.
Yes, I know his son.
Yeah, he used to stand there in front of the crowds and say, to this day, I will not buy any German product. And, it's sure not my place to say he's wrong.
Jim, what will we be studying next week?
Well, it's next week isn't actually next week.
Right.
It's like 3 weeks from now.
Right. It was
April
a trick
7th.
question because we're off for 2 weeks. But you caught it. You caught the
I passed.
Yeah, you did.
But
So-
the next session that we will have on April 7th, that particular one planned on focusing really on the survivors. And that's a little out of order, but the reason for that is because of Yom HaShoah, which starts the night of the 7th and carries into the 8th. So we'll even talk about why that is, what's the significance of that date. We'll address it briefly, but particularly because our featured speaker the following Sunday morning, Alex Kaur, is the child of survivors, including one who was extremely controversial in terms of what she did with her life after World War II. Felt we'd take it out of order and talk a little bit about survivors and think about that whole issue. So that's the next session.
Okay. It's 3:01. It's great to see everyone. Again, we have a community commitment meeting this evening. Rabbi's having a virtual Seder. If you need Any links for anything, please feel free to email me, theehrlich@mymacomb.org. And it's just great to see everyone. Thank you, Jim. Not an easy topic. I did start crying at the end, but it's such an important one.
Thank you all for coming and asking questions, and we'll try to keep time on all of these to talk a little bit. I'll try not to, I'm more than capable of going 60 minutes without a stop, but
I know that.
I won't.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you
Bye.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.